Welcome to the 902 Podcast, the official podcast of the Lancaster County Sheriff's Office in Lincoln, Nebraska. I'm Captain Vik, and I want to thank you for listening. This podcast will give you an inside look at LSO with topics and guests to discuss public safety issues impacting Lancaster County. Be sure to subscribe for highlights on news, cases, and the people working for you at LSO. You can also follow us across social media at LSO Nebraska on Facebook, X, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. Welcome to the 902 Podcast. We're a little bit out of sync today, and we've been busy.
We've been busy.
You've been busy.
There's some sheriffing to be done.
Yeah.
He complained yesterday about having to make his money to me.
Well, you know, I mean, some days you earn it more than others.
That's right.
It's like any other job in America. So, but you've definitely been earning some money lately, and it's what we're going to talk about today. We've been involved in the legislative session a little bit, or you guys have at least. So, I want to talk about that for our listeners that maybe don't know. But there's quite a few legislative bills on a pretty regular basis. I mean, whenever the legislature's in session, that have an impact on public safety and law enforcement specifically. So I think there might be some people out there that just would have the question in their head, well, why even get involved in the legislative process at all versus just, you know, we're cops. Shouldn't we just enforce the law? What would you say to someone that had that question?
Well, generally, you know, when bills are brought to our attention, and there are generally over 1,000 bills introduced. So the Nebraska Sheriff's Association has a lobbyist, and they monitor those bills that are germane to law enforcement, and specifically sheriffs. But then we look at the bills that are introduced that have something to do with sheriffs, and you try to mentally work through how you're going to apply that law. Can you do it? Number one, what's it going to cost you? Number two, and how's that going to affect operations? So it's really important that we try to visualize how we are going to implement the laws that get passed. And sometimes they're impractical, you know, they're expensive, and you know, you hear unfunded mandates all the time, and a number of our duties as sheriffs and sheriff's deputies are mandated by the legislature but not funded by them. So
Sure.
That's kind of the why.
And a lot of times we're experts in the field that they are writing the bill on. And so we get involved in that to give our 2 cents on what they are trying to do. And
because legislatures really don't have any idea how their bills are going to be put in action.
Maybe broadly, you know, that's the reason for, but there's sometimes some unintended consequences that they may not know.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. Do you think that as compared to some of your other sheriff colleagues across the state, I mean, do you think you are leaned on maybe more just out of proximity to the legislature, you know, to do some of those things?
You know, we have a legislative committee, and you know, I know Sheriff Miller from Buffalo County has made, you know, 5 trips in 10 days here to testify on bills. But then, you know, when Neil had a conflict or a bill came up that we weren't aware was going to come to hearing, they'll call me. And I was there a couple of times last week testifying for and against bills that were or not beneficial to sheriffs.
So you'll get notifications of bills through, you know, the Sheriff's Association or just through your own general research. But then I know sometimes, and we get this as division captains, sometimes you'll send out notices to us about fiscal notes.
Right.
What's a fiscal note for someone that doesn't know?
Okay, so generally the legislative fiscal note or fiscal office, they will forward the bill to somebody that's going to have to implement that bill. And in our case, you know, it'll be a law enforcement type bill, and they'll ask us what kind of fiscal impact this bill will have. Are we going to have expenditures? Are we going to have revenue from it? Are we going to require more people to implement it? And then what's that going to cost? And then they'll compile the fiscal notes for that particular bill. And so when it's presented to the committee and then obviously to the legislature, the senators can look at that and say, wow, this bill's going to cost a lot of money. So, for example, a bill was introduced by Senator McDonald that the state would pay for deputies and sergeants who are involved in courtroom security. So for us, that'd be about the folks we have involved in that task are about $2.5 million.
Yeah.
So that would be the physical note for the legislature. Here's what this is going to cost you. And then they've got to look at 93 counties and see
All across the state.
How, if we pay for the deputies and the sergeants that are involved in court security, what's that going to cost the state overall?
Yeah. Hey, I'm Captain Vik with the Lancaster County Sheriff's Office. When it comes to your career, don't settle for good enough. Don't settle for ordinary. We won't either. Be different, be better, be exceptional. Start your future today at joinlso.com. Well, that's kind of a good segue. So what are some of the bills that are of interest to public safety and law enforcement this session?
Well, I just mentioned the one on paying for court security. Another was a bill by Senator Brewer to do away with handgun purchase permits.
Yeah.
And, we issue those in Lancaster County. We issue about 4,000 of those a year.
Yep.
We've got dedicated staff to implement those provisions. And, there's a practical side of that and there's a physical side of that. And I think the practical side is that's probably not a bad thing to do away with the handgun purchase permits. Another bill introduced by Senator Brewer had to do with Controlled Substances Forfeiture Act. So people who are arrested for controlled substances violations have their assets subject to forfeiture. And so there's a bill, and that bill is 50 pages long. So you can imagine trying to read through 50 pages. How's that going to impact us?
Yeah.
How can we implement that? And is it even practical? And so, just like Ben said, my suggestion at the end of my testimony was that the legislature hold an interim study over between the end of this session and the beginning of the next, get some folks who are actually involved in criminal interdiction and explain how the process works so that they understand, and then when they craft a bill, they can consider those things.
That was the frustrating one with that bill, John, is they didn't ask law enforcement in any realm other than the AG's, Attorney General's office, to be part of that. And as I think people, if any of them listen to our podcast, they know that we are very heavily involved in criminal interdiction. And we're, half a mile, less than that from them, and they didn't invite us to come be part of that discussion. And that's the reason why we opposed the bill when it came up in committee, judiciary.
Well, I think a lot of these things you don't know what you don't know, and that was a good example. The handgun purchase permit bill, and we were kind of kicking that around just amongst ourselves too. In my mind, I just thought that, well, handgun purchase permits seem like a good thing. Probably everybody should have them, but I didn't realize it. Did we confirm Nebraska's the only or one of the few left?
One of the only, I think, that still has a handgun. And it's interesting because that law was initially passed in 1991.
Okay.
Very comprehensive. It really did a good job. NICS checks didn't exist back then, or if they did, they were very incomplete. They didn't have the entire criminal history. They didn't have mental health records.
And that's the federal check to to obtain a firearm.
So
Correct.
Businesses who are selling those can go on and check those.
Yeah, so if you go to a sporting goods store and you buy a gun, they have an 800 number that calls. They give your information, and then they get a response back from NICS. It's
at the time of purchase.
At the time of purchase, or they have up to 3 days to do it if there's a problem. But National Criminal something check.
Okay.
Anyway, it's the acronym is NICS. So over the years, NICS has become much better, and it has a much more complete criminal history record. It has a much more complete mental health records, and so if you go back to 1991, our handgun purchase permit was so good that NICS said to dealers in Nebraska, if somebody has a Nebraska handgun purchase permit, that will suffice.
Yeah.
That will do, because it's very comprehensive, and it was. In the intervening 30 years or so that we've gone down that path, now if somebody gets a handgun purchase permit, it's good for 3 years.
Yep.
If they get convicted of a disqualifier, let's say in 6 months from now, we really have no way to tie that handgun purchase permit to that arrest or conviction, and we don't have a real good recall method.
Yeah, I mean, we send a letter, we flag them in our system, but there's nobody that's actually going out and digging through their desk drawer to find that handgun purchase permit.
But if somebody in Lincoln, let's say, had a disqualifier after their handgun purchase permit, and they went to Grand Island to buy a gun, they probably wouldn't have any idea that there had been any kind of criminal violation here, and the handgun purchase permit would give them authority to buy that. So,
and that was really just we do a very thorough background check when we issue one, but that's really only a snapshot. And,
it is.
And I think a lot of people maybe had a false sense of security that handgun permitting process over those 30 years maybe isn't as robust as what we thought it was.
Well, it's not as robust now as
Today,
it was in 1991, exactly.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
maybe that particular process has run its course.
Okay.
And another funny thing, 91, it costs $5 to get a handgun purchase permit.
And how much does it cost today?
$5.
$5.
And, we've had to do physical alterations to our front door to accommodate the crowds. We've had to hire employees to handle the influx. And so if you can imagine, 4,000 of those permits coming through a year, and the background checks that are necessary, if there's some out-of-state questionable convictions, we have to make contact with those areas. It's very in-depth.
Well, and then in election years, they just seem to go even higher.
Well, with presidential elections, very much so.
Yeah,
Yes.
those handgun purchase permits were a great political barometer, if you would. So when it looked like Hillary Clinton was going to get elected, we did a record number of handgun purchase permits. Every time Congress talks about firearms restrictions, we get a record number of handgun purchase permits.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean they all go purchase guns, but that's...
Or that they're all granted.
That's true.
Yeah, yeah. So Ben, you spent some time testifying on the forfeiture bill.
Yes.
Maybe help some people know what does it do? What does it maybe not do?
Well, one of the big things it doesn't mention Department of Justice or Treasury and Homeland Security, who we work with as our federal partner in a criminal interdiction unit. They use the Treasury. And the bill does not mention that. It only mentions the Department of Justice. So with that, it's incomplete on that portion of it. It also, one of the frustrating things is it's only talking about forfeitures on drug cases and sex trafficking. But as everybody knows, we deal with gambling. We deal with credit card thefts. We deal with forgeries and things.
Human trafficking.
Yeah. All those other things that
stolen merchandise,
right?
Yep, that we could honestly take the individual's cash because it's from criminal actions, and that's one of the big things that they missed on the whole bill on that, and that was one of our biggest concerns on that too.
Well, and I think that's the picture that's painted in everybody's mind is that when they hear of interdiction, a lot of times their mind goes to drugs, but it is a lot of other things, and we actually covered. I was just looking back to make sure I tell folks the right episode on that, but episode 21 we did last summer on criminal interdiction, and so people can hear all about the way that we do it at the Lancaster County Sheriff's Office. Now, it's not to say that every law enforcement agency does it that way, but I'm pretty proud of the way that our office does it, and hopefully there might be some time just to have some of those conversations.
Well, there was some articles by Flatwater Press that wasn't so shining this year, and it caught wind with some of the senators, and I think that's one of the reasons why this bill got spurred and brought up. Would you say that's correct, Sheriff?
I think so. I think that that article, those articles, and some others led the Platt Institute and the ACLU to suggest this legislation to Senator Brewer. If you want a challenging career, a career where you can make a difference in your life, your family's life, and the lives of those in your community, come and join the Lancaster County Sheriff's Office. To learn more or to apply, visit us online at www.joinlso.com.
Any others on the radar or horizon that
there were bills about changing title inspection, some of the provisions there. So of course we do title inspections here.
Yep.
It's another state mandated function of sheriffs, and we look at that to make sure can we do this?
Yeah.
Is it going to make our life easier? Is it going to make it more difficult? Are we going to have to put more personnel toward that task now? So, and I'm trying to think what.
Well,
other...
I testified on the lid.
Sure. I mean, that's not even a law enforcement issue, but they were proposing a lid on local government spending.
Yeah.
And we were advocating for an exemption for public service or public safety.
Yeah. And so there was a bunch of us from all across the state went and testified to that. And, we just kind of discussed how much we really have a control over our budget. And one of the things that, we have a little over an $18 million budget, but 15 million of it is salaries and benefits that we have absolutely no control over. And then there's some other things that we don't have a lot of control over, like motor vehicle fuel, contracts with like 911, because we don't have our own 911. We use the Lincoln Police Departments, and we end up paying for them. And that's not in the Child Advocacy Center, and that's about $500,000. Or
which would still be
way
cheaper than if we had to go and do that ourselves.
Yes. I mean, stand up our own 911 center. Yeah.
So when you do start to look at some of those external costs.
Yeah, when you really look at things of what we have very little control over, it's $16.5 million out of that budget. So when people are asking us, hey, what can you cut?
We've got about 8 or 9% of our budget that we can
discretionary.
And a good example is, I think this year and last year we drove all of our fleet about 1,200,000 miles. Pretty consistent on both years.
Yep.
But our fuel budget this year was $100,000 more than last year.
Yes.
And that's one of those variables that we just never know what the cost of fuel is going to be. And even though we're driving the same amount of miles and doing the same things, we're spending $100,000 more in fuel than we were a year ago. So it helps to explain to senators those issues like Ben just talked about. Here are the things that we can control.
Certainly.
We can control buying paper clips and, pens and paper and, copy machines, that sort of thing. But even deputies' wages, I mean, they negotiate with the county board, and the county board is bound by the rules of the Commission of Industrial Relations.
Yep.
So they may or may not have a lot of ability to limit that. So it's a catch-22, and it helps to explain that to the senators. And
well, it's our technology too. Everybody in the public has, and for good reason, body-worn cameras, in-car cameras. They'd like to have all that on law enforcement. Well, that's not cheap. And you have to update so often to keep with the times. And you're talking millions of dollars in just those pieces of equipment. And it just doesn't take long for our budget to start rising quickly.
Well, and the three of us are taxpayers, and we don't want our tax dollars being spent in ways that might seem like we could do without or be better spent in one way or another. But the other thing is, we go to the grocery store. Our costs are more expensive to us as individuals, but we as a government agency, that's not necessarily different either, because we're still having to buy, even within that discretionary amount, supplies are more expensive. Just the
uniform costs are more expensive.
Uniform costs are more expensive. So the same factors that impact somebody's household budget at home with some of the inflationary expenses, they hit us too. And so, just to be able to kind of freeze spending or cap spending, it sounds good to me as a taxpayer. But when the rubber meets the road, I also have to balance that with that's going to impact our ability to deliver public safety services to people that expect them to be there.
everybody complains about property taxes because that's sort of the most in everybody's face.
Yes.
The state gets no property tax, and the city and the county are funded. Property tax are their primary funding source.
Yeah.
So if you're going to take away the primary funding source, then you have to take away some of the functions that the state has mandated us to do,
Yep.
or allow us to charge user fees on some of those issues that are for a specific group of people.
Yep.
So there's a lot to consider there, and
Yeah. And nuanced quite a bit of it. I mean, it's just complex.
It'd be like a standard state cut income tax. Yep. We don't get any of that, but you need to cut state income tax. Mm-hmm. Well, we don't know how they disperse that, how they use that, and what kind of impact that would have. So, yeah, it's.
Well, another thing that came up this year was the inheritance tax. And I don't think a lot of people understand how that's going to affect the county. Now, as a private citizen, I understand why you would not want that wholeheartedly, but some of that money that comes from those, we only have really two ways of getting funds, property tax and inheritance tax. And if you take away the inheritance tax, where else are we going to go, and what are people already complaining about?
Well, certainly lots of conversations yet to be had, and this is the reason why we have a representative government, hopefully, so that people can ask the right questions and talk to the right people and hopefully make good decisions.
You know, every bill that comes before the legislature gets introduced, gets a public hearing. So if there are 1,100 bills introduced this session, and this is the second part of a two-year cycle, but all of those bills get a public hearing, and sometimes I know Ben was there till 6:30 at night talking about one bill, and just depending upon how the schedule is and how many people want to discuss a given topic that may not, they'll schedule 4 or 5 bills in an afternoon for debate or for testimony. And then there's some bills that are really controversial that take a long time.
Yep.
And you just have to wait until your bill comes up and you can testify on what you think about that particular bill. So,
yeah, it's funny. You sit there forever and you testify for 3 minutes and hope they ask you some questions so you can elaborate. But that's all you get.
Yeah, that's all you get is 3 minutes.
Yeah. Well, we just appreciate you guys taking the time to help us out and understand a little bit about how that process impacts the sheriff's office specifically and public safety on a little broader level. So we'll see what this session brings. And, if not this one, I'm sure there'll be more excitement on the next one. So,
well, I'll bet.
This one's the short one, so they can only do so much.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Well, that's all the time we have for the 902 podcast today. We appreciate everybody listening. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow and subscribe. Check out our other episodes anywhere you listen to podcasts, Apple, Spotify, or across the interwebs. You can also check us out on social media at LSO Nebraska, Facebook, Instagram, X, YouTube. Are we on Snapchat now? I think we have a Snapchat account and TikTok too, but check us out all over social media. And most importantly, if you're interested in career opportunities at the Lancaster County Sheriff's Office, we are currently hiring for deputy sheriffs, and you can find more information about that at www.joinlso.com. Thanks for listening.